We believe that a law and order which depends on intimidation and repression to secure obedience can have but one name, and that name is tyranny. That was the statement written up by 8 Americans and then relayed to a wire service reporter. You see, for a good while, they sensed that something was terribly wrong. They could just feel it. They were sure they were being watched. Or maybe infiltrated is the right word. They had not been able to prove it, though. Until the night they risked their freedom, that is. So the group consisted of John and Bonnie Raines, Bob Williamson, Keith Forsyth, Sarah Schumer, Ralph Daniel, Judy Feingold, and the group's leader, William Davidon. They all had begun to notice strange incidents happening inside the organizations that they belonged to. Anti-war, feminist, and civil rights circles. Spaces where trust was supposed to be a given. But over the last years, something was just off. It seemed as though people would just, out of the blue, turn on each other. So this group of Americans decided to try to find the proof that their suspicions that something was off were correct. However, there was only one way that they knew how to do this. They chose a night when nearly all of America would be distracted. During the fight of the century featuring the great Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier on March 8, 1971. Most Americans experienced the fight through radio broadcasts because this was the time of the predecessor of pay-per-view, pay per seat. Promoters believed that they could make far more money by forcing people to pay per seat rather than airing it freely on network TV. So those who could afford it would watch it via closed-circuit television, which could be accessed through movie theaters, arenas, or other special venues. By the way, the tickets could cost anywhere from $5 to $25, which would be around $40 to $200 in today's economy, and basically a shit ton of money for 1971. So people sat in their homes, radios cranked, trying to catch every part of the fight as humanly possible. The group was pretty sure that the police attention would be elsewhere. They weren't wrong because they weren't the only folks to realize that the fight would be a great opportunity to commit crime. If there was ever a moment to catch a glimpse of the little man behind the curtain pulling the levers and sowing mistrust, they believed it would be this night. Once they picked the night, they began planning. William Davidon, well, he had a hunch. A small FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, seemed an unlikely place to keep paperwork detailing classified information. However, it was also well understood that bureaucratic institutions such as the FBI loved paperwork and probably kept a ton of it in all of their offices. They watched and cased and planned meticulously. They learned the layout of the office thanks to the only woman in the group, Bonnie Raines. Even though she was 29 years old and a parent, she bravely went undercover into the offices of the FBI as a student, under the premise of interviewing them regarding hiring practices for women. She knew she could go in there and play the naive, unsuspecting little girl, all the while scoping the entire place and memorizing the layout, seeing where the doors were located and where the filing cabinets sat. Because of Bonnie, the group knew exactly where to begin. They planned escape routes, figured out ways to handle different situations that might arise, and secured ways to protect each other from being discovered. They vowed never to speak about what they were going to do, and also to never see one another ever again, except for the husband and wife, of course. On the night of the boxing match, the 8 of them met at a hotel room to prepare. They got dressed up in business attire with large suitcases ready to go. What the crew didn't yet realize, though, was that the whole operation would teeter on just one thing: the lock on the door to the room with the file cabinets that contained all the files that they needed. And their locksmith. Keith Forsyth was the first of them to go into that FBI office in Media that fateful night. He took a locksmith course some weeks back and even found ways to master the art of picking locks by installing a few into some drywall to practice on. The lock on the door to the room with the files was a piece of cake. It was the second lock that was a problem. A second lock. He wondered to himself how he hadn't seen this when he previously cased the place. He also wondered if he hadn't previously seen this second lock because it was brand new, which could mean that they'd been infiltrated. This second lock was a cylinder lock. Keith began freaking out. He made contact with the rest of the group, and a decision was made to use a second door that Bonnie had spotted while doing the faux interview in the office. The only problems, were that there was a padlock on the inside of this door, and also a filing cabinet directly in front of it. The fight was blaring on a radio in an adjacent room, believed to be the building owner's apartment. Every time something exciting happened in the fight, the volume would swell, allowing Keith to first carefully break the padlock with one of his cloth-covered tools. Then he got on the floor to begin slowly moving the filing cabinet that blocked the door. This took a little time. He began to sweat, thinking about someone seeing him in this vulnerable position. He would literally be caught red-handed. There would no doubt be prison, quite possibly for life. But within around 5 minutes, he inches the cabinet forward enough so that the rest of the group can fit inside. His job, at this point, is mostly finished. 4 members of the group shimmied their way inside the room in their business suits, pulling the suitcases behind them, and they began forcing open all of the filing cabinets. They empty the office of every single file that they can get their hands on. Everything. They walk out of the building with the loot, and across the street, a security guard noticed them leaving. Saw all of them carrying these large suitcases, placing them one by one into the trunks of their cars, moving quickly, but not too quickly, and resembling FBI officers. They must have looked legit because the guards seemed to think nothing of it. It looked like business as usual. Federal agents finishing a late night. The group loaded into the 2 cars that were waiting outside and disappeared into the evening. They drove to a farmhouse, which had been borrowed from some Quakers that they knew, and began sifting through what they'd taken, page after page, memo after memo. The first thing that jumped out at them was a phrase in one of the documents that said, "It's time to enhance the paranoia. Make sure that an FBI agent is thought to be behind every mailbox." Super weird. And that was only the beginning. Though they didn't yet understand the full scope of what they'd uncovered, these documents would expose the most secret domestic operation in FBI history. They had just cracked open the very source of a shit ton of illegal surveillance, infiltration, and repression ordered straight from J. Edgar Hoover himself, the little man behind the curtain. We believe that a law and order which depends on intimidation and repression to secure obedience can have but one name, and that name is tyranny. This group called themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI, and they had quite literally been dead on with their suspicions. I'm Nicole Davenport, and this is Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. Hello again, listeners. I just wanted to give a little heads up that there are people in the building moving today, so there might be a little background noise that I will try to edit out. Just a heads up. I also wanted to say that this podcast supports helping your communities. Getting involved at a local level can influence the people around you. A small content warning due to discussions of political violence and sexual assault of children. That being said, let's get into it. In the year of 1968, many parts of the world were rising up. So much so that it got a name. Global 1968. Global 1968 refers to a wave of uprisings and mass protest movements that occurred around the world, as the name kind of implies. It wasn't a single coordinated movement, and it didn't share a unified ideology, but it happened. What linked these events was timing, conditions, and overlapping grievances. Real grievances, by the way, not white replacement theory grievances. All across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia, large numbers of people, particularly students and young adults, and there were a lot of them thanks to the baby boom, they challenged existing political and social structures. These challenges took different forms depending on local context, but they emerged in response to similar struggles: prolonged war, authoritarian governments, and limited avenues for participation or social representation. Now, one of the most visible common threads was opposition to the Vietnam War, even in countries not directly involved militarily. Televised images, internal reporting, and transnational student networks meant the war began being experienced as a global issue rather than an out-of-sight, out-of-mind conflict. Something else that was a key characteristic of Global 1968 was resistance to authoritarianism, though what counted as authoritarian varied a lot by country. In Western democracies, protesters challenged police power and surveillance. In Eastern Europe, resistance often targeted one-party rule and the suppression of reform movements, most notably during the Prague Spring. There was also a rejection of established political elites, including both conservative governments and traditional left-wing parties. Many participants viewed existing institutions as unresponsive or straight-up illegitimate. This contributed to skepticism toward party hierarchies and encouraged experimentation with new forms of organizing that emphasized participation over representation. Youth and student leadership was another big thing during this era. Expanding university enrollment after World War II created huge, concentrated populations of young people with access to ideas, tons of time, and shared spaces. As we know about the 60s, universities became areas for activism. They functioned as meeting places for discussion and planning how to take action. Now, I know this sounds bonkers right now in the present time, but despite ideological differences, many movements shared a common ground critique of Cold War binaries. Activists often rejected the idea that global politics had to be divided strictly between U.S.-aligned capitalism and Soviet-aligned communism. In reality, this meant opposing U.S. military intervention while also criticizing authoritarian communist regimes, because both of these things can exist at once, right? Methods of protests across the world during the Global 1968 also showed similarities. Demonstrations, strikes, and occupations appeared repeatedly across countries. In some cases, protests escalated into large-scale shutdowns of universities or cities, or in some cases, both. In others, they were met with violent repression, as seen in Mexico City in October of 1968. As Mexico prepared to host the 1968 Summer Olympics, students protested inequality and authoritarian rule under President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. The government responded with escalating repression, big surprise, culminating in the Tlatelolco massacre, where hundreds were killed just days before the games. The Prague Spring, mentioned just a few minutes ago, was a 1968 reform movement in Czechoslovakia led by Alexander Dubček, who was aiming to create socialism with the human face, as he called it, through greater freedoms, until it was crushed by a military invasion from the Warsaw Pact. Germany's 1968 student movement arose after the police killing of a student named Benno Onesori in 1967, and intensified after the attempted assassination of sociologist and activist Rudi Deutsche in 1968. Students demanded many things. A few of those things were education reform, press freedom, democratic participation in universities, accountability for Nazi-era ties, and solidarity with global anti-imperialist causes, including opposition to the Vietnam War. In France, students and workers staged massive strikes demanding societal transformation. And similar movements were happening in Italy, Japan, Poland, Brazil, Northern Ireland, and China, too. But this global movement was not uniformly successful, not the way you and I might want it to be, nor did it lead to immediate systemic change. Many of the movements were suppressed and fragmented. However, the period marked a shift in how dissent was expressed and perceived. Protest and activism became more public and more confrontational, too. It also became more difficult for governments to ignore. This global atmosphere matters because it shaped how activism inside the United States was understood by authorities. Domestic movements unfolded during a moment when unrest was appearing on television sets worldwide, even though somewhat censored or filtered in some countries. I just wanted to provide a small history lesson. I just wanted to provide a small backdrop as to why any political dissent within the United States during the 1960s was met with surveillance and covert repression, such as with COINTELPRO. In the United States, the unrest associated with the global 1968 developed over the course of the 1960s, shaped by civil rights organizing and Cold War politics, only made worse by the steady escalation of the Vietnam War. By the middle of the decade, opposition to existing political structures had begun to consolidate into identifiable movements, each with different strategies and priorities. One of the earliest of these movements was what became known as the New Left. Emerging in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the New Left was largely driven by students and young intellectuals who were dissatisfied with both mainstream liberal politics and older party-based forms of leftism. Rather than focusing narrowly on labor or class struggle, the New Left emphasized anti-racism and opposition to militarism, and also the strong belief that ordinary people should have a direct role in political decision-making. Organizations such as Students for a Democratic Society reflected this approach. Early New Left activism centered on campus reform and civil rights solidarity. Over time, though, internal tensions emerged. Disagreements over ideology and leadership, and also the role of violence within the movement, contributed to fragmentation of the group. Some groups used tactics of civil disobedience, while others, such as the Weathermen, later referred to as the Weather Underground, used bombs to incite terror in order to, at some point, overthrow the government? As the Vietnam War intensified, these divisions only deepened. By the late 1960s, the New Left as a cohesive organizational force was weakening, even as opposition to the war itself was growing. It included a wide variety of groups: students, clergy, veterans, civil rights activists, and people with no prior involvement in radical politics. The war provided a clear point of contention: mass drafting and rising American casualties, alongside mounting evidence of civilian suffering in Vietnam. COINTELPRO was already very much active by this point, primarily against civil rights organizations and black liberation groups, as we learned in previous episodes. And as anti-war activism grew, the program expanded and expanded to include all of these extra groups, of course. The FBI's concern was not limited to acts of violence either. Groups that were nonviolent but effective at mobilizing people and attracting public sympathy were also viewed as threats. New left organizations had been under COINTELPRO surveillance since the early 1960s. Student groups that challenged U.S. foreign policy or formed alliances with civil rights organizations were monitored through informants and wiretaps, the collection of internal documents, same old dirty tricks that Hoover's F.B.I. used. And faith-based anti-war activism was treated similarly. Members of the Catholic left, including figures such as Daniel Berrigan and Philip Berrigan, were closely monitored. Daniel Berrigan was many things: a priest, an activist, also a poet and writer. In 1968, he traveled to North Vietnam as part of a peace delegation. The visit had a lasting impact on his work and activism. While there, he witnessed the effects of U.S. bombing campaigns on civilians, including children injured and killed by napalm. After returning, Berrigan wrote and spoke about what he had seen, describing the physical aftermath of napalm attacks and the human cost of war. These accounts, which appeared in essays, poems, and public statements, became central to his anti-war resistance. For Berrigan, opposition to war became a part of life, grounded in what he observed while he was in Vietnam. This experience further shaped the Catholic left's emphasis on moral witness. One of the earliest and most influential Catholic left actions took place in October 1967 and became known as the Baltimore Four. Participants included Philip Berrigan, who by that point had already been imprisoned for earlier draft resistance. Okay, this is how it went down. The group entered a Baltimore draft board office with their own blood, presumably, on hand, and poured it over draft records. The use of blood was intended to represent the blood being shed in Vietnam, and to draw a direct connection between administrative processes at home and physical violence abroad. In May 1968, a group later known as the Catonsville Nine entered a draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland. Among them were Daniel and Philip Berrigan. They removed hundreds of draft files and burned them outside using homemade napalm that they got from a chemistry teacher they knew. The napalm was intentional and symbolic, of course. It was to demonstrate what napalm was doing in Vietnam. The Catonsville action became one of the most widely known examples of draft resistance and influenced similar actions elsewhere. It also intensified federal attention toward the Catholic left networks, though. The 8 individuals who carried out the Media, Pennsylvania FBI burglary had already been a part of the activism realm. Several were connected to religious or anti-war networks. One of the burglars had even been a freedom rider from the not-so-long-ago segregation protests of buses, and many were influenced by the example set by the Catholic left activists, including the Berrigans. I was just fascinated while I was researching this. I understand that we live in an era now of constant surveillance thanks to things like CCTV and different technological advancements. So doing these certain types of activism, like was done during the 60s and 70s, is impossible. But these activists did some wild shit. By 1968, opposition to the war had reached a scale that could no longer be ignored. This became obvious during the 1968 Democratic National Convention. It exposed deep divisions within the U.S. Democratic Party over the Vietnam War, intensified by the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy and President Lyndon B. Johnson's withdrawal from the race. Outside the convention, anti-war protests led by the Yippies and Students for a Democratic Society, participants of the left, the New Left, erupted into violent clashes with police under Mayor Richmond Daley. One of the most symbolic moments came when the Yippies staged a mock convention and nominated a live pig named Pegasus for president, an absurdist protest that underscored their rejection of establishment politics before police cracked down in Lincoln Park. scenes of which were later broadcast nationwide. Inside the convention hall, Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey secured the nomination despite fierce opposition from anti-war delegates backing Eugene McCarthy. Not that McCarthy. The televised violence and party infighting fractured Democratic unity and weakened Humphrey's campaign against Richard Nixon. The convention's legacy reshaped Democratic delegate reforms, but also became a lasting cautionary tale, frequently invoked in later decades, including debates surrounding the 2024 election, when internal divisions over U.S. policy in Gaza once again raised fears that party infighting could cost Democrats politically. And let's face it, it did. The United States was facing a kind of convergence of forces at the end of the decade. A fragmented New Left, a rapidly expanding anti-war movement, and conscience-driven draft resistance. And with that, we got a government apparatus increasingly focused on monitoring and neutralizing dissent. This convergence would shape everything that followed. By the end of the 1960s, the FBI no longer treated opposition to the Vietnam War as isolated or episodic protest. It was understood as part of a broader pattern of domestic instability unfolding alongside global unrest. Because of this, the expanding anti-war movement became a central focus of COINTELPRO activity. Now, from the FBI's perspective, these new types of activism posed a particular challenge. Activists framed opposition to the war as a matter of conscience rather than ideology. They carried out highly symbolic and public acts of civil disobedience, and most of the time accepted arrest and imprisonment. COINTELPRO activity against these networks included sustained surveillance and the use of informants. By the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement, COINTELPRO no longer limited itself to just surveillance and information gathering. Internal FBI documents later revealed that the program relied heavily on disruption, often through tactics that were deliberately personal and humiliating, and what I would call petty, honestly, but more serious than that as well. One documented tactic involved direct interference with meetings. In some anti-war groups, FBI operatives or informants sabotaged gatherings in small but intentional ways designed to create confusion and mistrust, and sometimes illness. Former activists later described incidents in which food left out during meetings, such as fruit placed on shared tables, was tampered with, including injection of laxatives. These actions were intended to discourage attendance and create discomfort associated with the collective activity. Another common tactic was the use of forced correspondence. The FBI sent anonymous letters to individuals and organizations within the anti-war movement, often posing as fellow activists, just as we've discussed in earlier episodes with other COINTELPRO targets. These letters accused people of infidelity, financial dishonesty, or disloyalty to the cause. The intent was to inflame suspicion and provoke internal conflict, fracture trust between organizers. In internal records, agents sometimes described these efforts openly as successful in creating discord, bragging about their exploits even. And not surprisingly, COINTELPRO also relied heavily on informants and coercion. Individuals with prior arrests or financial vulnerability were pressured or incentivized to provide information. In some cases, people on the margins of society were used to gain access to meetings or social spaces connected to the movement. The goal was intelligence collection, of course, but also the quiet erosion of solidarity through fear of infiltration. What's really fucked up about this whole thing is that many targeted groups were engaged in lawful protest, draft resistance, or political organizing. These methods, revealed through documents obtained in the media Pennsylvania burglary and later confirmed during congressional investigations, illustrate how the anti-Vietnam War movement was handled as a social force to be undermined from within. What the FBI was hoping for with COINTELPRO operations was to make participation riskier and more psychologically taxing, because dissent itself was framed as the threat when it came to the FBI. Now, by 1970, tensions between student protesters and authorities had escalated further, particularly on university campuses. On May 4, 1970, at Kent State University, Ohio, National Guard troops fired into a crowd of students protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. The shootings became one of the most enduring symbols of state violence against the anti-war movement. 10 days later, on May 15, 1970, police and Mississippi State Patrol officers opened fire on a dormitory at Jackson State University. 2 black students were killed and 12 were wounded. The context of the protests included opposition to the Vietnam War, as well as long-standing racial tensions. Despite similarities to Kent State, the Jackson State killings received significantly less national attention, which showed disparities in media coverage and public responses, which, let's be honest, we still see in the present day. After the university shootings, the risk associated with protest became unmistakable. At the same time, COINTELPRO continued to operate largely in secret, extending its reach into additional movements and refining its methods. By the early 1970s, the anti-Vietnam War movement encompassed mass protest, moral resistance, and draft obstruction, and it had been met with surveillance and violence, both overt and covert, thanks to Hoover's weird ideas about communism and how the everyday American should behave and live. From this point, the trajectory will lead us forward into COINTELPRO's targeting of the women's liberation movement and feminist organizing, followed by the intense repression of indigenous activism, particularly the American Indian movement. So, as COINTELPRO kept expanding and expanding, it did not limit itself to movements associated with militancy or disruption, as we already know. Women's liberation and feminist organizations were also subjected to surveillance, despite being overwhelmingly nonviolent and focused on social and legal reform. FBI agents covertly attended meetings and monitored discussions. According to later congressional investigations, much of what was recorded involved women speaking about their lives, their lack of power, workplace discrimination, and unequal treatment within families and institutions. These meetings did not involve plans for some violent uprising or criminal activity of any sort. The inclusion of feminist groups within COINTELPRO's scope revealed the breadth of the program's definition of what they considered a threat to be. Advocacy and collective discussion, activities protected by the First Amendment, were treated as matters of national security. Although women's liberation was not the primary focus of COINTELPRO, its surveillance demonstrated how far the program extended into ordinary civic life. One of the most revealing windows into how the U.S. government applied COINTELPRO logic to the women's liberation movement comes from the experience of Roberta Salper, a scholar, teacher, and organizer active from 1968 into the early 1970s. Salper was involved in both New Left and feminist organizing, helping establish early women's studies and initiatives in consciousness-raising groups. What she later discovered, though, through a Freedom of Information Act request, fundamentally altered her understanding of how far federal surveillance extended. In the early phase of her political life, the FBI began compiling records on Salper in 1968. Her file, thousands of pages long, contained basic information about her academic appointments, passport and travel details, and press clippings of her public appearances. It included material submitted by informants who attended meetings Salper participated in, women's caucus gatherings, feminist discussions, and collaborative events. These reports were repeated across field offices and forwarded to FBI headquarters forming a detailed record of her involvement in the emerging women's liberation movement. Even with this level of documentation, the FBI initially didn't view the women's movement as a threat to national security. It's almost like they just enjoyed illegally reading about the personal struggles and lives of women. In the Pittsburgh FBI office in late 1969, internal memoranda concluded that Salper's feminist activism, including public speaking and organizing on issues of gender inequality, did not justify placing her on the FBI's security index, which was a list reserved for individuals whose detention could be sought in a declared emergency. At that stage, women's liberation was seen as marginal and limited in scope rather than a disruptive force. What changed was that Salper's feminist work became increasingly connected with the broader movements and institutional structures. As her involvement with the new university conference, the NUC, continued, her organizing was seen in the context of the New Left, which the FBI had already categorized under COINTELPRO. Her presence in NUC's Women's Caucus and her work to integrate feminist issues into a wider program of social transformation drew greater attention because how dare she? Internal records show the FBI began to track debates and strategy discussions, interpreting them against a backdrop of anti-imperialist and socialist critique. The escalation became most evident when Salper helped establish one of the first formal women's studies programs in the United States, first in Pittsburgh and later at San Diego State University. The existence of a real academic program with courses, syllabi, and official support reportedly prompted the field offices to collect and mark materials as confidential, circulating them within the Bureau. So what had once been informal gatherings and loosely affiliated discussions was now tied to institutional development, and the FBI treated this as a meaningful extension of political influence. Finally, a little fucking recognition. Throughout this period, the methods used were consistent with other COINTELPRO operations, though they were carried out under the guise of routine intelligence gathering. Informants attended not only workshops and meetings, but also social events linked to women's organizing. Reports were generated about internal disagreements and other pieces of what they probably considered to be juicy gossip. Feminist publications and newsletters and course descriptions were copied and forwarded. Once again, the surveillance was not targeted at violence or criminal activity because there was none of that, but rather at ideas, influence, and organizational capacity. Even after the supposed end of COINTELPRO operations in 1971, Salper's name was still added to the ADEX, the Administration Index, and this was in 1973. Being on this list meant that in a declared national emergency, she could be subjected to preemptive detention. The classification placed women's liberation, even when its activity was nonviolent and educational, within the same security framework that had been used for civil rights leaders and anti-war organizers and other COINTELPRO targets. The decision reflected how federal authorities interpreted the intersection of feminist activism, and Salper's experience illustrates how surveillance did not end with the public exposure of COINTELPRO in 1971, as many had incorrectly thought. She found that documents were withheld or heavily redacted under national security exemptions, and significant portions of her file remain unreleased. This suggests that the logic of COINTELPRO, the monitoring and managing of dissent or perceived dissent, continued well after the program's formal termination. The case reveals that the women's liberation movement was surveilled because as it grew, it intersected with other movements and came to be seen as part of a broader pattern of political change that federal agencies seemed to obsess over. In reflecting on this history, it's noticeable how, across decades, multiple forms of state power have intersected with violence against women and women-led movements when those movements overlap with other axes of oppression. The recent killing of Renee Good, a mother and community member shot and killed by an ICE agent named Jonathan Ross during federal enforcement operations in Minneapolis, has sparked protests all over the U.S. and also questions about federal authority and civil rights. Good's death and the controversy over the official narrative versus eyewitness accounts continues to generate public outcry and debate about accountability and limits of state power. The cases of Good and Salper are not the same in context, but they resonate with the long history of how structures of authority interact with women's lives and movements, especially where activism intersects with issues of immigration, race, class, and gender. Speaking of Minneapolis, the American Indian Movement, the AIM, had emerged there in 1968, but its origins cannot be understood without looking much farther back. AIM developed in response to more than a century of U.S. policy toward Native peoples, particularly policies aimed at assimilation through family separation. Beginning in the late 19th century, way after the first colonizations that we spoke about in the second episode of the Witch Hunt series, the U.S. government implemented a system of Indian boarding schools, as they called them, a policy that expanded rapidly after the 1870s and continued well into the 20th century. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to distant institutions designed to eliminate indigenous languages, religions, and cultural practices. These schools operated under the explicit goal of assimilation. Children were punished for speaking their own language. Their hair was cut, their names were changed, and they were subjected to harsh discipline. Many experienced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. In addition to abuse within the schools themselves, children were frequently placed into what was known as the outing system. Under this system, Native children were sent to live and work in white households during breaks from school, often as domestic servants or agricultural laborers. These placements were framed as opportunities for moral improvement and vocational training, but in practice, they functioned as unpaid labor and extended the separation from family and community. The boarding school era left long-term trauma that affected multiple generations. By the mid-20th century, direct boarding school placements began to decline, but assimilationist policies did not end. From roughly the 1950s through the 1970s, a new phase of child removal intensified. In the United States and Canada, large numbers of Native children were taken from their families and placed with non-Native foster or adoptive families. This period is often referred to, particularly in Canada, as the 60s scoop, though the practice extended beyond that decade and occurred across borders. Unlike boarding schools, this system removed children permanently from their communities. Native families were frequently deemed unfit based on poverty or cultural practices. These children were raised often without knowledge of their tribal affiliations or identity. While the terminology varied by country, the underlying goal remained the same: assimilation through family separation. It was against this backdrop that the AIM formed. In urban centers like Minneapolis, Native people faced disproportionate police violence and surveillance, often leading to incarceration. On reservations, federal neglect and poverty were widespread. The American Indian movement's earliest work focused on monitoring police behavior and providing legal support. But the movement quickly expanded to address treaty rights, sovereignty, land theft, and the cultural survival of their people. So one direct response to the legacy of boarding schools and the child welfare system was the creation of survival schools. These community-run schools were designed to keep children with their families while providing education rooted in indigenous history, including culture and language. Survival schools rejected the idea that Native identity needed to be erased in order for children to succeed, like some twisted zero-sum game. They were practical institutions, but also they were political statements asserting the right of Native communities to educate their own children. The AIM's demands reflected these historical conditions. The movement called for many things, some of which were the enforcement of existing treaties, recognition of tribal sovereignty, an end to police brutality, protection of land and resources, and accountability for violence against Native people. Many AIM activists also connected their struggle to opposition to the Vietnam War. Native Americans served the U.S. military at high rates despite continued discrimination and dispossession at home. For some, participation in foreign wars raised a question shared by other marginalized groups. Why fight for a government that denied basic rights to one's own people? National attention to AIM increased through a series of high-profile occupations. In 1969, Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island, invoking treaty language that allowed Native people to reclaim unused federal land. The occupation lasted 19 months, and it reframed indigenous resistance as a present-day political struggle rather than a historical one. In 1973, AIM activists and residents occupied Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre of Lakota people by U.S. troops. The occupation protested treaty violations and corruption within tribal governance structures, backed by the federal government. It lasted 71 days and involved armed standoffs with federal law enforcement, including the FBI, of course, and U.S. Marshals. These confrontations occurred alongside patterns of unpunished violence against Native people. Native women in particular, don't forget, were also being subjected to forced sterilization during this time, and they and their families were often targets of violence and sexual assaults by white men who were never held accountable. A widely cited case of violence against indigenous people involved Raymond Yellow Thunder, an Oglala Lakota man who was abducted, beaten, and left to die by white men in 1972. Initial legal responses were minimal. The case became a rallying point for AIM, illustrating how violence against Native people was often dismissed or deprioritized within the justice system. Another case that further inspired the American Indian movement was that of Yvonne Monroe. In August 1972, Yvonne, a Native woman and mother, became involved in a fatal confrontation that would later have significant legal and political consequences. On the day of the incident, Monroe left her 2 children with a friend, Shirley Hoover, while she attended a medical appointment. You see, Yvonne was recovering from a broken leg and had to wear a cast and use crutches. Shirley had expressed concerns about safety within her own home, which was isolated and poorly lit. In months prior, Shirley's young daughter had been sexually assaulted, and in the days leading up to the incident, signs of attempted break-ins had been observed. That afternoon, one of the children reported that a neighbor, William Wessler, had grabbed him. Shirley's daughter then identified Wessler as the man who had previously assaulted her. Shirley contacted the police, who took a statement but told her that they could not arrest Wessler until a formal complaint was filed the following weekday. Police also suggested defensive measures, but did not remove Wessler from the situation. Later that evening, Shirley contacted Yvonne and asked her to come to the house. Yvonne advised Shirley to bring the children to her home instead, but Shirley declined. Yvonne went to the residence, where additional information surfaced that Wessler had previously attempted to molest another child and had a history of institutionalization. During the night, Yvonne, Shirley, and other family members stayed awake to watch over the children. In the early morning hours, Wessler arrived at the house in an intoxicated state. An argument ensued after he entered the residence. When Wessler moved toward one of the children, a confrontation escalated. Yvonne fired her weapon, killing Wessler. She also fired at another man who accompanied him, wounding him as he fled. Shirley contacted emergency services. Yvonne admitted to the shooting during a recorded call and expressed distrust of law enforcement. That recording was later used as evidence against her at her trial. Yvonne was initially convicted of second-degree murder and first-degree assault. The prosecution argued that she was not in immediate danger and had taken the law into her own hands. The defense contended that she acted in self-defense and in defense of children, taking into account her physical disability and the circumstances of the threat. In 1975, an appeals court overturned Yvonne's conviction, citing multiple errors, including improper jury instructions on self-defense and the failure to allow expert testimony on cultural and gender context. The court held that the jury should have been instructed to consider the defendant's perceptions of danger, including those shaped by gender and physical vulnerability. And the Washington Supreme Court ultimately upheld this reasoning. The decision became a landmark win in U.S. law, particularly for women asserting self-defense. After a plea agreement, Yvonne received a suspended sentence and probation, along with community service. She took this opportunity of freedom to become active in indigenous and environmental advocacy. The Wanro case became significant not only as a feminist legal precedent, but also within indigenous activism. It highlighted disparities in how Native women were treated within the criminal justice system, and was supported by both women's rights organizations and the American Indian movement, which used the case to draw attention to broader patterns of inequality. As the American Indian movement grew more visible and confrontational, it, of course, became a target of federal surveillance. The FBI classified AIM under COINTELPRO's Native American category, employing tactics similar to those used against other movements. These included infiltration by informants and efforts to exploit internal divisions. Law enforcement responses to AIM protests were frequently militarized, leading to injuries, deaths, and prolonged legal battles. One of the most consequential deaths associated with the American Indian movement occurred during a period of intense surveillance and internal strain. Anna Mae Aquash, a Mi'kmaq activist and prominent organizer within the AIM, was murdered in late 1975. Aquash was active during a time when AIM was still heavily infiltrated by FBI informants and subjected to COINTELPRO-type tactics. And among these tactics was what's known as bad jacketing or snitch jacketing. And we know this thanks to the previous episode, right? It's a practice in which individuals were falsely or ambiguously portrayed as informants in order to generate internal suspicion and distrust. In the months before her death, Aquash was accused by some within the movement of being an informant, an allegation for which no evidence has ever been substantiated. She strongly denied the accusation. Her disappearance and subsequent murder occurred within an environment marked by fear and misinformation and pressure from federal law enforcement. Aquash's body was discovered in February 1976 on the Pine Ridge Reservation. She had been murdered execution-style. Years later, several AIM members were convicted in connection with her killing. Historians, investigators, and former activists have argued that the climate of suspicion produced by COINTELPRO tactics played a significant role in the conditions that led to her death. Her case, along with countless others during COINTELPRO operations and beyond, portrays the severe consequences of counterintelligence operations that destabilized movements internally, demonstrating how surveillance and psychological warfare could have lethal outcomes, even without direct state violence involved. By the late 1970s, the American Indian movement had weakened substantially, though it's absolutely still around. Its headquarters are located in its founding place of Minneapolis. Indigenous activism has continued in many forms and continues today. So, I know what you're thinking. What happened with the burglary? The burglary of the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, didn't immediately end COINTELPRO, but it fundamentally altered what followed. When the stolen documents were mailed to journalists in 1971, thanks to our leftist burglars, they provided the first concrete evidence that the FBI had been running a covert, nationwide program aimed at domestic political movements. Until that point, COINTELPRO existed largely just as lore or a source of rumors or suspicion among activists. The documents made it verifiable. Initial press coverage was very cautious. Some outlets hesitated to publish any of it, uncertain whether the materials were authentic or whether publication would provoke federal retaliation. Once reporting began, however, it became clear that the FBI had systematically targeted lawful political activity, often in secret and without judicial oversight. The exposure contributed directly to mounting pressure on Congress to investigate federal intelligence agencies for literally the first time ever. That pressure culminated in the creation of the Church Committee, formerly known, get ready for this, as the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities. Gotta love these official titles of the government oversight committees of the yesteryear. Anyway, the Church Committee, active between 1975 and 1976, conducted an extensive investigation into the FBI, CIA, NSA, and other intelligence agencies. Its findings confirmed that COINTELPRO was not an isolated program or a series of rogue actions, but rather a sustained effort approved at the highest levels of the FBI. The committee documented that COINTELPRO targeted a wide range of domestic groups, including, as you and I already know, civil rights organizations, anti-war movements, feminist groups, and indigenous activists. And there were tons more that I haven't even mentioned, by the way. One of its most striking findings was the imbalance of enforcement priorities. The FBI devoted far more resources to surveilling and disrupting left-wing and anti-establishment groups than to monitoring right-wing extremist organizations. Yep, sounds about right. According to committee records, the majority of COINTELPRO operations were directed at what the FBI categorized as New Left and Black liberation groups, while white supremacist organizations, such as the KKK, received comparatively less sustained attention, despite documented involvement in violence and terrorism. In some cases, informants within the Klan were protected or left in place, even after participating in violent acts. The committee also detailed the methods used under COINTELPRO. These included the same old that we already know, infiltration, anonymous letters intended to sow distrust, but also manipulation of employees and landlords, dissemination of false information, and coordination with local law enforcement to increase arrests or harassment. J. Edgar Hoover, who had directed the FBI since 1924, died in May 1972, shortly after the media burglary, but before the Church Committee convened. Hoover had personally authorized and overseen COINTELPRO, as we know. His leadership style centralized his power and discouraged even internal dissent, making the program difficult to challenge from within the Bureau. And he never faced any real accountability. Hoover's death marked the end of an era at the FBI, but it didn't immediately result in transparency or reform or anything like that. Many COINTELPRO files were destroyed in the early 70s, and the full scope of the program may never be known. What did survive, though, was enough to demonstrate that the FBI had routinely violated constitutional protections in the name of national security. The FBI formally ended COINTELPRO in 1971 after its exposure became public. Following the Church Committee's findings, new guidelines were introduced to limit domestic intelligence operations. These reforms included restrictions on surveillance of political activity and increased oversight by Congress and the courts. However, the Church Committee itself acknowledged that ending a program did not necessarily eliminate the underlying logic that produced it. Intelligence agencies continued to operate under national security frameworks, and later programs just adopted new names and new ways to go undetected. The historical record shows that COINTELPRO was exposed and investigated, and supposedly officially terminated. It also shows that the methods were embedded in broader institutional practices, though. And this unresolved feeling of tension is where the story ultimately closes. Until our next episode, that is, with the close of the Witch Hunt series, which will highlight two very misogynistic myths, the crack baby myth and the CIA's influence of it, thanks to the Iran-Contra incident, and also the welfare queen myth. See you next time, and remember, stay vocal, stay vigilant, because silence is complicity.